Welcome to Ghost Stories of the Battles, your portal to the eerie shadows of history's pivotal moments. Today, let's delve into the ghostly lore of Los Alamos, the haunted town that served as the birthplace of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. High in the isolated mesas of northern New Mexico lies Los Alamos, a place where history and mystery intertwine. Known as the birthplace of the atomic bomb, it was here during the Manhattan Project that some of the greatest scientific minds gathered to change the course of history. But great power often comes with great cost, and many believe the price paid at Los Alamos extends beyond the physical and moral realm. The site carries an eerie legacy, its dark past echoing through abandoned buildings, secret tunnels, and shadowed forests. Stories of spectral figures, strange sounds, and unexplainable phenomena have persisted for decades. Did the unleashing of atomic power disturb forces beyond our understanding? Or are these hauntings tied to the lives lost and the moral weight carried by those who worked here? Prepare yourself for a journey through the haunted corridors of Los Alamos, where science and the supernatural collide. Los Alamos wasn't always a hub of scientific discovery. Before it became a secret city in the 1940s, the area was home to the San Ildefonso Pueblo and later served as the site of the Los Alamos Ranch School, a private institution for boys. In 1943, the U.S. government requisitioned the land for the Manhattan Project, under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer. A team of scientists worked tirelessly to develop the first nuclear weapons. The culmination of their efforts led to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing an end to World War II, but forever changing the world. The moral weight of their creation left a mark on many of those involved. Some spoke of sleepless nights and haunting regrets, and others refused to discuss their work at all. Perhaps it is this unresolved guilt, combined with the area's history, that gives Los Alamos its ghostly reputation. Story 1. The Shadow in Fuller Lodge. Fuller Lodge stands as a silent sentinel of Los Alamos' storied past. Its tall wooden beams and rustic charm have seen countless moments of joy, sorrow, and tension. Built in 1928, as the heart of the Los Alamos Ranch School, the lodge later became a hub for the scientists and staff of the Manhattan Project. Its walls absorbed laughter from community dances, whispered debates over classified breakthroughs, and the weighty silence of those contemplating the power they were about to unleash on the world. Today, it serves as a community center and museum, preserving the legacy of those who walked its halls. But for Carla Vega, a night janitor, Fuller Lodge was more than a historical site. It was a place she'd come to fear. A place where shadows didn't always stay in the dark. Carla had taken the janitorial job 6 months ago, grateful for steady work after a string of layoffs. She liked the quiet hours, the solitude of cleaning in the dead of night when the world was asleep. But there was something about Fuller Lodge that made her uneasy. The lodge always felt alive, as if it were watching her. The creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded like footsteps. The wind outside often moaned through the building's wooden frames, carrying whispers that made her pause. Just an old building settling, she muttered to herself one evening as she vacuumed the grand hall. The room's vastness made her feel small. The chandelier overhead swayed gently, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The first time Carla saw the shadow, she was scrubbing the baseboards near the fireplace. The hall was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the work light she had plugged in nearby. As she wiped the cloth along the wood, she felt it. A chill on the back of her neck, like a breath of cold air. She turned sharply, her eyes darting across the room. Nothing. Shaking her head, she went back to work. But then she saw it, a dark figure standing on the balcony above. It was tall, unmoving, and distinctly human in shape. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, its edges blurred as though it were made of smoke. Carla's heart pounded. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it toward the balcony. The beam revealed nothing but the wooden railing and empty air. After that night, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the lodge. The shadow appeared again, and each time it felt closer, more menacing. Sometimes, she'd catch it out of the corner of her eye, only for it to vanish when she turned to look. Other times, she'd hear faint footsteps on the balcony or soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. She told her boss about the experiences, but he laughed it off. Fuller Lodge is old, Carla. Old buildings make noise. You're probably just tired. But Carla knew what she saw, and she wasn't the only one. One evening, a historian visiting the lodge after hours stopped Carla in the hallway. "Do you ever feel watched here?" the woman asked, her brow furrowed. Carla hesitated. "What do you mean?" The historian gestured toward the Grand Hall. "I've been studying the Manhattan Project for years, and I've heard stories about this place. Workers talked about strange happenings. Cold spots, shadows moving. Some even said they felt a presence, like someone was standing right behind them." Determined to understand what she was experiencing, Carla began researching the lodge's history. She learned about its role during the Manhattan Project, how it had been a gathering place for overworked scientists trying to steal moments of normalcy amidst their heavy responsibilities. But she also discovered the darker stories, workers who'd succumbed to the pressure, taking their own lives in despair. One account stood out. A man named Henry Morse, a physicist who had spent countless nights pacing the lodge's upper balcony. He was said to be racked with guilt over the bomb's potential for destruction. In 1945, just weeks before the Trinity test, Henry was found dead in his quarters, an apparent suicide. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that Henry's shadow still lingered, unable to rest. The storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds swallowing the moonlight as Carla finished mopping the grand hall. The wind howled outside, rattling the lodge's windows. As she turned off her work light, the shadows seemed to deepen. She felt the chill again, sharper this time, and her breath came out in visible puffs. "Enough," she said aloud, gripping her flashlight. "Whoever, or whatever, you are, just leave me alone." Her voice echoed in the empty hall, followed by a deafening silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. They echoed from the balcony above, growing louder with each step. Carla aimed her flashlight at the stairs. The beam shook in her trembling hands. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man in a faded suit, his face obscured by shadow. He stopped at the top of the stairs, his head tilting slightly, as if studying her. "Who are you?" Carla whispered, frozen in place. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the fireplace. Carla turned, her eyes widening as she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a small plaque embedded in the wood. She approached it cautiously, her hands shaking as she wiped away the dust. The plaque read, "In memory of Henry Morse. May his soul find peace." When she turned back, the figure was gone. Carla never saw the shadow again, but the memory lingered. She left her job at Fuller Lodge a month later, unable to face the building's oppressive atmosphere. Still, she couldn't forget Henry Morse. His story stayed with her, a reminder of the personal cost of the Manhattan Project. She began volunteering at historical sites, sharing her experience and advocating for the preservation of personal histories alongside technological achievements. "I think he just wanted to be remembered," she told a group of visitors during a tour. Not as a scientist, but as a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. And Fuller Lodge, with its silent halls and watchful shadows, remains a place where history refuses to rest. Story 2: The Weeping Woman of Bathtub Row. Bathtub Row was a name born out of quiet irony. In the early days of the Manhattan Project, only the most senior scientists lived in the row of charming adobe style houses that lined the mesa. They were given indoor plumbing, a luxury at the time, earning the row its peculiar nickname. These homes bore witness to groundbreaking discoveries and the burdens of those who made them. They stood as silent participants in history, soaked in the triumphs and tragedies of the atomic age. But one house, in particular, carried a story no one spoke of aloud. It was said that late at night, when the wind carried just right, you could hear soft, heart-wrenching weeping coming from its walls. For historian Anna Morales, the assignment to document the homes of Bathtub Row was a dream come true. She'd studied the Manhattan Project for years and had always been drawn to the human side of the story. But her week in the weeping house would make her question everything she thought she knew about history and about the world beyond. Anna arrived in Los Alamos on a crisp autumn afternoon. The town buzzed with the energy of preservation projects, eager to honor its place in history. The house she'd be staying in, a charming adobe with a small garden, looked perfectly ordinary. The curator who handed her the keys warned her with a smile. "Some people say it's haunted. Don't let the story spook you." Anna chuckled. "I'll take my chances." The first night passed uneventfully. Anna spent hours unpacking her research materials and jotting down notes in the living room. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. But on the second night, as she lay in bed, the sound began. A faint rhythmic weeping that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. At first, Anna dismissed it as her imagination. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises. She rolled over and buried her head under the pillow, willing herself to sleep. But the next night, the weeping returned. It was louder this time, unmistakably human. Anna sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound came from the bathroom, just down the hall. She grabbed her phone, the dim light from the screen her only comfort, as she crept toward the source. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the sound grew louder as she approached. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The weeping stopped abruptly. The bathroom was empty, the air cold and heavy. The faucet dripped once, twice, then stopped. Shaken but determined, Anna spent the next day delving into the house's history. She pored over old records, letters, and photographs, looking for clues. It wasn't long before she found a name: Margaret Henderson. Margaret had been the wife of a senior scientist during the Manhattan Project. Isolated from friends and family, with no knowledge of her husband's work, she had struggled to adjust to life in Los Alamos. A neighbor's account from 1945 described Margaret as a kind but deeply lonely woman who seemed haunted by something she couldn't name. The account ended with a chilling note. Margaret had taken her own life in the bathroom of the house, just weeks before the Trinity test. Anna's hands shook as she read. Could Margaret be the source of the weeping? That night, the house came alive with unsettling energy. The weeping began earlier, echoing through the halls as Anna tried to write. Her desk lamp flickered, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind her. When she turned, the room was empty. Unable to concentrate, Anna moved to the living room. She curled up on the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. That's when she saw it. The faint outline of a woman reflected in the glass of the front window. The figure wore a white dress, its edges blurred like smoke. Her head hung low, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Margaret," Anna whispered. The figure vanished. The final night in the house brought the most terrifying experience yet. As Anna lay in bed, the weeping returned, louder and more anguished than ever. The temperature plummeted, and the lights flickered erratically. Anna bolted upright as the bedroom door creaked open on its own. The sound of running water echoed down the hall. Gathering her courage, Anna grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound to the bathroom. The faucet was running, steam curling up toward the mirror. As she stepped closer, she saw words forming in the condensation. Why didn't he stay? Anna's breath caught in her throat. "Margaret, is that you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The mirror fogged again, and another message appeared for me. He left suddenly. The room spun. Anna felt as if she were falling, and when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the bathroom. She was standing in the past, a silent observer of a moment frozen in time. Margaret stood in front of the mirror, her face streaked with tears. She clutched a letter in her hands, her body trembling with anguish. Anna couldn't read the words, but she knew they carried devastating news. As Margaret collapsed to the floor, the vision dissolved, and Anna found herself back in the present. The next morning, Anna left the house early and went straight to the curator. She shared what she'd experienced, her voice steady despite the fear that still gripped her. The curator listened carefully and then nodded. "You're not the first to see her. Margaret's story is a tragic one. Maybe she just needs someone to acknowledge her pain." Together, they organized a small memorial for Margaret. They placed flowers in the bathroom and read a letter aloud, apologizing for her suffering and honoring her memory. Anna spent one final night in the house. This time, the weeping didn't return. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. When she left Los Alamos, Anna carried Margaret's story with her, determined to share it with the world. She wrote an article about the forgotten lives of those who lived in Bathtub Row, weaving history and her haunting experience into a narrative that touched many. Margaret Henderson's story reminds us that history isn't just about the moments that make headlines. It's about the people who lived through them, their joys, their sorrows, and sometimes their ghosts. And for those who visit Bathtub Row, one house stands as a poignant reminder of the cost of progress. Listen closely, and you might still hear the echoes of a woman whose pain was too great for silence. Story Thorough. The Whispering Lab, the abandoned laboratory at Los Alamos, wasn't on any official tour. Tucked away at the edge of the Mesa, it was a relic of the Manhattan Project, one of the many facilities where dangerous experiments had been conducted in secrecy. Though the lab had been sealed off for decades, rumors about it persisted. Some said the lab was haunted by the spirits of workers who had perished in tragic accidents. Others whispered about strange voices heard echoing through the halls. For Mark Taylor, a physicist working on a modern research project in Los Alamos, those were just stories. But during one long, lonely night in the Whispering Lab, Mark discovered that some rumors are grounded in chilling truth. Mark had been excited about his posting in Los Alamos, a rising star in the field of quantum mechanics. He'd been recruited for a classified government project. His work required access to state-of-the-art facilities, but when a technical failure rendered his lab unusable, he was granted temporary use of one of the old Manhattan Project buildings, the Whispering Lab. "Be careful in there," joked his supervisor. "Some say the ghosts of Los Alamos still haunt those halls." Mark laughed. "I'll let you know if I meet Einstein's ghost." The lab was a time capsule of mid-20th century science. Its peeling walls were lined with outdated equipment, and the faint smell of chemicals lingered in the air. Mark found it fascinating, a tangible connection to the brilliant minds who had worked there. At least, that's how he felt during the day. Mark's first late-night session began like any other. He worked methodically, analyzing data and running calculations. Around midnight, the hum of his equipment was interrupted by a faint sound, whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind or the creaking of the old building. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew clearer. "Leave." Mark froze. The whisper was faint but unmistakably human. He shook his head. "Just my imagination," he muttered, turning back to his work. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. They were fragmented, disjointed phrases that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Stop! Why are you here? Jet out." Mark grabbed his flashlight and walked the length of the lab, his pulse quickening with each step. He found nothing but empty rooms and dusty corners. He returned to his desk, unnerved but determined to continue. The next night, Mark returned to the lab, determined to ignore the whispers. He worked for hours without incident, but just as he began packing up, he noticed something strange. A chalkboard that had been blank earlier now displayed a series of equations. The handwriting was precise but unfamiliar. Mark stared at the board, trying to make sense of the equations. They appeared to be related to nuclear physics, but they included terms he didn't recognize. "Who's messing with me?" he muttered, snapping a picture with his phone. As he turned back toward the desk, he saw a shadow flicker at the edge of his vision. He spun around, but the room was empty. The following day, Mark couldn't stop thinking about the equations. He showed them to a colleague, who was equally baffled. "It looks like something from the early days of nuclear research," she said. "Where did you find this?" Mark hesitated. "Just something I came across." Curious, he dug into the history of the Whispering Lab. He discovered that it had been the site of a catastrophic accident in 1944. A team of scientists had been conducting a criticality experiment when an error caused a burst of radiation. 3 workers died instantly, and several others succumbed to radiation sickness in the days that followed. One of the victims, Dr. Robert Kane, had been a brilliant physicist known for his groundbreaking theories. He had reportedly spent his final days scribbling equations, desperate to complete his work before his death. Mark's stomach turned as he recalled the chalkboard. Could it have been Kane's work? Mark's next visit to the lab was his last. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, he stayed well past midnight. The lab felt different that night. Colder, darker, more oppressive. As he worked, the whispers began again, louder and clearer than before. "You don't belong here. Stop this. Leave." Mark gritted his teeth, refusing to be scared off. "If you've got something to say, say it," he shouted. The room fell silent. Then, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept across the windows, and Mark's breath came out in visible puffs. He felt a presence behind him and turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was a man in a lab coat, his face pale and hollow-eyed. His lips moved, but his voice was a whisper. "You have to stop. They can't know." Mark stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "Who are you?" he stammered. The figure pointed to the chalkboard, where new equations had appeared. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, as if the man were begging him to understand something crucial. Before Mark could respond, the figure vanished, leaving the room in silence. Shaken, Mark left the lab and never returned. He spent weeks analyzing the equations, eventually sharing them with a trusted mentor. Together, they uncovered an insight into nuclear stability that had been decades ahead of its time. Mark became convinced that the spirit of Robert Kane had been trying to pass on his unfinished work. But he also believed Kane had been warning him about the dangers of pushing the limits of nuclear research. The lab was permanently sealed after Mark's experience, its secrets buried alongside those who had perished there. Mark continued his research, but he carried with him a profound respect for the past, and for the unseen forces that lingered in its shadows. To this day, the Whispering Lab remains a chilling reminder of the price of progress. And for those who dare to listen, its ghosts still have much to say. Story 4 True. The Phantom Fire on Pajorito Plateau. The Pajorito Plateau is a rugged, windswept expanse, dotted with juniper trees and ancient volcanic rock. Its natural beauty belies its dark history. During the Manhattan Project, it was here that scientists tested dangerous experiments, laying the groundwork for weapons that would change the world. But for locals and visitors, the plateau is also a place of eerie tales. Hikers report strange lights flickering in the distance, glowing like campfires but leaving no ash or embers behind. Others speak of ghostly figures wandering the trails, their outlines faintly luminescent in the night. For Alina Chavez, a park ranger stationed near the plateau, these stories were little more than folklore. That changed one summer evening when she encountered the Phantom Fire firsthand, and the spirits of the past revealed themselves in a way she could never forget. Alina loved her job. She spent her days guiding tourists, maintaining trails, and keeping an eye on the wildlife. Nights on the plateau were her favorite, the stars spilling across the sky like a blanket of light. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena set out on a routine patrol. The air was still, the chirping of crickets her only company. She followed a familiar path that wound through the mesa, her flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. As she crested a hill, she froze. In the distance, a flickering light danced against the night. Campers, she muttered. Camping was prohibited in this section of the plateau, a rule strictly enforced due to the area's historical significance. She radioed the station. "This is Elena. I'm seeing a possible unauthorized campfire near Site 18. Going to investigate." "Copy that," came the reply. "Be careful out there." Elena moved cautiously toward the light. As she drew closer, she noticed something strange. The fire didn't behave like a normal flame. It didn't flicker in the wind or throw sparks into the air. Instead, it glowed steadily, a pale, otherworldly orange. When she was about 20 yards away, she called out, "Hello. This is a restricted area. You need to leave." The fire dimmed slightly but didn't go out. No voices responded, no movement stirred the brush. Elena took another step forward, and the fire vanished. Her flashlight beam swept the ground where the fire had been. There was no ash, no charred wood, nothing to suggest a campfire had ever been there. A chill ran down her spine. "Probably just my imagination," she said aloud, though her voice wavered. She turned back toward her truck, but before she'd taken more than a few steps, she heard it faint voices, murmuring in the distance. The next morning, Elena reported the incident to her supervisor. He shrugged it off. "Probably hikers messing around. Happens all the time." But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Determined to understand what she'd experienced, she began researching the history of Site 18 and the surrounding area. She learned that the Plato had been used for high-risk tests during the Manhattan Project. Early experiments with radioactive materials and chemical explosives had taken place there, often with limited safety protocols. In 1945, an accident occurred. A small team was testing the effects of an experimental chemical reaction when something went wrong. A flash fire engulfed the site, killing 3 workers and injuring several others. According to records, their remains had been difficult to recover due to the severity of the burns. Elena couldn't ignore the connection. Could the fire she'd seen, and the voices she'd heard, be tied to this tragedy? A week later, Elena returned to the plateau for another evening patrol. This time, she brought a camera, hoping to capture evidence of the phantom fire. As she walked, the air grew heavy and a strange stillness settled over the land. Even the crickets were silent. Then she saw it again, the same pale flame flickering in the distance. She raised her camera, snapping several photos as she approached. "Hello," she called. "Is anyone there?" The fire dimmed, and for a moment, she thought it would vanish again. But instead, it grew brighter. As she drew closer, she saw shapes materializing around the fire. Figures in lab coats, their faces shadowed but their outlines glowing faintly. Elena's heart raced. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figures didn't respond. They stood motionless, staring into the fire. Then one of them turned, its face becoming clearer. Its eyes met Elena's, and she felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Fear, pain, regret. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the center of the fire. Elena stepped closer, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. The flames parted, revealing a charred, rusted piece of equipment. A relic from the Manhattan Project. As Elena reached for the object, the world around her shifted. She was no longer on the plateau. She stood in a makeshift lab, surrounded by bustling scientists. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for their experiment. She saw the moment the accident happened. A flash of light, a roar of flame, and the panicked cries of workers scrambling for safety. 3 men were trapped at the center of the fire, their faces with terror as the flames consumed them. Then, just as suddenly, she was back on the plateau, her hand outstretched toward the ghostly fire. The figures were gone, and the flame vanished with a soft hiss. Alina fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Over the next few days, Alina shared her experience with a local historian. Together, they organized a small memorial at Site 18, honoring the workers who had died in the accident. They placed a plaque near the site, inscribed with their names and a promise of "We remember your sacrifice." After the ceremony, the sightings of the phantom fire diminished. Hikers still occasionally reported strange lights, but the sense of unease that once pervaded the area seemed to lift. Alina never forgot what she saw on the plateau. To her, the phantom fire was more than just a ghost story. It was a reminder of the human cost of progress, and of the lives that had been lost in the pursuit of knowledge. For those who venture into Pajorado Plateau at night, one piece of advice remains. If you see a flickering light in the distance, tread carefully. The past has a way of reaching out, and its flames still burn. Los Alamos is more than just the birthplace of the atomic bomb. It is a place where history lingers in both physical and metaphysical forms. The stories of ghosts and unexplained phenomena serve as a reminder of the lives touched, and sometimes destroyed, by the pursuit of power and progress. For those who visit, Los Alamos is a haunting mix of scientific triumph and moral reckoning. And for those who dare to listen closely, it is a place where the past refuses to stay silent. Have you ever felt the presence of history in a place? Share your experiences of haunted sites or locations where time seems to stand still.